Hey, sister travelers, do you struggle with deciding where to go in your travels? And maybe you have overwhelm with so many choices. Well, today's episode, stay tuned. We're going to talk about 5 important factors when you're considering where to go to travel. Is fear holding you back from traveling because you don't have anyone to go with? Are you concerned about being a woman traveling alone and not sure how to prepare for a solo trip? Do family and friends think you are crazy for even considering solo travel? Well, in this podcast, you will become equipped to travel safely by yourself. You'll learn things like tactical travel tips and how to prepare for a trip and how to overcome the fear so you can discover the transformation that travel can bring. My mission is to see more women over 50 discover how travel can empower them. If you want to enjoy your next travel adventures solo, then start your journey here. Hello, sister travelers. I'm Cheryl, solo travel advocate and travel coach. I have experienced life-changing adventures through travel, and I want the same for you. So stay tuned here every week, and you will learn to find freedom through your travels, build your confidence while safely navigating new places. Welcome back to Solo Travel Adventures. So, how do you decide where to travel next? How do you pick a place to go to on your next trip? Do you have a huge list like myself? I mean, the world is full of beautiful and wonderful places, far and near to yourself, wherever you may live. It can be sometimes hard to decide, right? You have a whole list of places you want to get to. And obviously, we have some things to consider when we're considering where to go next. So, number one thing that you would want to consider before you decide where you're going is, first, what kind of time do you have? Are you on any kind of time constraints? If you only have an extended weekend, for example, maybe 3-4 days, obviously you're not going to be flying somewhere very far that you would lose time at that destination just because of the time it took you to travel. And even when you have just a week, possibly, depending on where you are from, then you need to determine, okay, I want to spend a week, but you don't want to fly halfway across the world, because we know when we do that, we essentially lose about 2 days of travel, okay, one on each end. So that really only leaves you about 5 days in that destination. Or if you have time, let's say you have 2 weeks or more, then yes, you're going to probably want to consider maybe somewhere pretty far that by traveling that far, you're not really taking too much time away from having sufficient amount of time to see your destination, okay? For example, if you're flying maybe from Australia to the US, you're not going to want to spend just a week there. You're going to want to spend at least 2 weeks, maybe more. Also, a lot of people from the US that fly over to maybe Southeast Asia, or they go to Japan, or they go to China, that while they're over there, while they're on the other side of the pond, that they go to other places. So they allow themselves more time, because once you've made that trip, as you know, right, whatever, how many hours, 12, 16-hour flight, whatever it might be for you, you might as well see some other places that are maybe close to where your original destination is. So time will determine where you can go, right? And that would be number one thing to kind of look at when you're looking at your schedule and how much time. Well, what if you have all the time in the world, right? What if you work remotely and time is not an issue? Well, then maybe point number 2 might be something you want to consider. It would be financial cost, money, all that lovely stuff. If you are on a budget, then obviously going to Bora Bora or the Maldives or any place expensive like that might be out of the question. You might even consider just staying nearby or close and doing your travels within your own country. I know there's plenty to see, and maybe you're bored, but then think of just maybe a short, maybe 2-hour flight somewhere, right? Where could you go in 2-3 hours on a flight? simple enough to get places. For example, in Texas, 3-hour flight to Belize. That's it. I mean, you could go to Central America essentially and not have to fly too far. So that's, thinking about costs too, the cost to fly. Budgets. Looking if you are flexible with time. In episode 18, I talked about how to plan your trip backwards, and this was a way to actually save money. So if you're flexible with where you go and you have available time, so maybe point number 1 is not an issue, but you still want to keep it on a budget. That is a great tool to use. You can go back and listen to that episode on how to, book your flights and find some cheap ones that way. And as I mentioned before, you can also just consider staying somewhere close, and also consider places that are just known to be less expensive. We know some of the bigger cities are going to be more expensive, whereas some of the lesser known places will be less expensive. And, certain countries are actually in general less expensive than, just where you're from, like less than the US for sure. For example, areas such as Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, they all tend to be cheaper. And even my son just got back from Japan and mentioned how inexpensive it was in Japan as well. So places like that, if you have the time, right? Time's not an issue, but you want to keep your costs down. Look into places that are less expensive, maybe closer to home, and then do your trip planning backwards and listen to episode 18. And that's one way you can cut cost and, be a little more adventurous maybe on where you pick to go. Point number 3 to consider is visas. Okay. We in the U.S. are rather fortunate in that we can pretty much go almost anywhere and really not have to apply for visas. In Europe, though, we have time limits for our visas, and there are still some countries where you need to apply for a visa before you go. All right, so maybe that's a factor. Maybe you don't want to deal with that hassle. So, if your plan is to go to a country and in your research you discover that you're going to need a visa for it, then you may want to consider another place. Or if you have the time to apply for one, and can wait to get it before you leave, then that might not be an issue. Okay. Point number 4, how do you decide? Well, it could be due to personal connections, word of mouth. Maybe you heard about a place from somebody and just decided on a whim to go there. Or maybe you know somebody in another country or another city, and you decide to take advantage of maybe visiting them and maybe having, free room and board possibly, or just some place that you know somebody, so maybe they could also show you around. So, for example, my trip last month in April, I went to Bruges, Belgium because of word of mouth. It was highly recommended by a number of people, not just one. And to be honest, that was one of the highlights of my trip in April. Bruges was beautiful, and I do highly recommend it. So there's your little tip. But you might hear word of mouth from other people, their experiences in another country, and so you are wanting to maybe experience that as well. So you put that on your list, right? You look into it, and if the first 3 items don't concern you, time, money, or visas, and then maybe you can just decide based on word of mouth, right? And if you know somebody. And then the final reason that, how do you decide where to travel? There are times when I have to just follow my heart. And I know that there's people out there that have done that. They just feel a draw or that pull towards a certain country, a certain area. Maybe it's Italy, you just feel a draw there. Or maybe it's something to do with your heritage and you want to go back to that country where your ancestors came from. And so there's this gravitational pull. And so you're just following your heart, right? So that's okay. And as long as those other items are not an issue, then I say go for it. Follow your heart. And that's kind of what I'm planning for my fall trip, is just going to follow my heart. I'm feeling a pull to two possible areas. And so just doing some research right now on those two areas. Now, cost does play into it and time as well. So it may come down to, I've had those two, to decide, and it may come down to whichever one has maybe the cheaper flight, cheaper accommodations, that's probably the way I will go. But there's two that are really drawing my heart right now that I so want to go see. So I might reveal those later once I decide which one I'm going to follow there. But you got 5 factors to consider when you're trying to decide. Maybe you play a game too. I didn't plan to say this, but maybe you just do a little. I've seen some people where they put up, maybe a map of the world, or maybe just a map of your own country, and they throw a dart, and then that's where they're going to go. That is so fun. That's so spontaneous. If that's you, go for it. I think that's a wonderful idea to just kind of keep it interesting. So that's another thought that you could do. If none of the other reasons are a factor, then I say be spontaneous. Pick something, do the dart thing. Maybe just like close your eyes and point to something, right? And go, I'm going there. Then you're going to have probably a wonderful adventure. And that's what I love to hear about adventures that women go on by themselves, whether planned or spontaneous. Remember, sisters, I'm going to be giving you an extra episode every Friday of June coming up this week. So these are little quick trip travel tips, right? That you can use for your summer travel, right? They're just lovely, small little tidbits that are going to help your summer travel go a lot smoother. So listen in for those, or make sure you have subscribed so you don't miss them starting this Friday. Hey, sister travelers, did this podcast inspire and encourage you, or move you to get out there and travel? Wonderful. There are 3 ways you can thank me. First one is leave a written review for the show on Apple Podcast. 2, share the show with your sister travelers, your friends, your family. And 3, subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. And thank you again for listening to the show. Sisters, be fearless, take the leap, and get out there and have an adventure.